research examines the social structural processes underlying health disparities in a variety of settings, including Kenya, South Africa, and Washington, D.C. And her current work uses mixed methods to examine gender disparities in HIV rates among African youth, the HIV epidemic among older adults in rural South Africa, and the HIV epidemic among African Americans in Washington, D.C. She's published several articles on her work with adolescent girls in Kenya, culminating in a soon-to-be-released book with the University of California Press, which I'd recommend we all purchase upon its release in May, entitled Love, Money, and HIV, Becoming a Modern African Woman in the Age of AIDS. She earned her PhD from the University of Chicago in 2008. Sanyu, welcome, and thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to present a talk on transactional sex. I'm particularly interested in providing historical, comparative, and theoretical perspectives on transactional sex, and I look forward to the Q&A afterwards. So I'll first begin with talking about why transactional sex is important to think about in light of the HIV epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. I'll then talk about transactional sex comparatively, specifically looking at transaction in relationships in the U.S. I'll then discuss the historical underpinnings in the U.S. and why these are similar to other settings. I'll then spend the rest of the presentation focusing on three theories: the patriarchal bargain by Denise Candiotti, the purchase of intimacy by Viviana Zeliza, and then the global production of consuming women, which is a key theory I develop and use in my forthcoming book, Love, Money, and HIV. So why does transactional sex matter? As many of you know, Africa bears a disproportionate burden of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And the latest UNAIDS report estimates that 71% of people living with HIV and AIDS are in sub-Saharan Africa. It's about 25 million people. And the epidemic is feminized, with 60% of African victims now women. And so the UNAIDS report also notes that on average, young African women have 3 times the rates of young men. But there's wide variation in the gender disparities in HIV rates, depending on the country we look at when we look at DHS surveys. So it's young women have twice the rates of young men in Zimbabwe, 9 times the rates in Malawi, 5 times the rates in South Africa. But a key mechanism in the literature identified is that young women have relationships with older male partners who have higher rates of HIV. Now, these quantitative findings have been matched by qualitative data on young women's relationships to the widespread accounts of transactional relationships in West, East, Central, and Southern Africa. I define transactional relationships as sexual relationships in which money is exchanged, but in which issues of love and trust are sometimes also considered at stake. So these relationships are usually with older or slightly older men who can provide small or large amounts of money in the context of sexual relationships. So it's important to understand the micro as well as structural drivers of transactional sex in order to limit young women's vulnerability to HIV. So now for a bit of comparative history. I think it's important to first recognize that the notion of transaction in intimate relationships is not unique to Africa. So I thought it would be useful to first start off by looking at transaction in other settings to sort of put the African case in context. So if we think about the case of the U.S. historically, historian Beth Bailey shows in her work how in the 20th century, men's money in the U.S. became central to dating and courtship practices, especially once dating moved out of the home and into the public sphere. So initially there was a calling system where men would come to the woman's house for tea, cake, and at-home entertainment. But once dating came along, then men had to take a girl out, and that involved money. So they had to literally spend on romance, so movies, dinner out, public entertainment, and so on. And in this way, she shows how romance became synonymous with consumption. And as others, including Eva Illouz, has argued, romance becomes in some ways incomplete without consumption. And so even now, even though increasing numbers of couples split dating costs in the U.S., it's nonetheless true that there's a greater flow of money, gifts, and resources from men to women than vice versa. So if we take the example of the engagement ring, a recent survey found that more than 80% of American brides have an engagement ring at an average cost of about $5,000. And so I've put a few ads up on the screen, and the copy is really telling. So, for example, the first one, she already knows you love her. Now everyone else will too. There's a sense in which a diamond is like a code for love. It's codified love. Right, so there's an idea that a diamond or other such gifts are a sign or symbol of love. So the bigger the diamond, the greater the love. But it's not just about love. So in some of Sylvia Chan's work, she says the jewelry that a wife displays is a showcase of her husband's wealth. So there's a sense here in which a wife is not just displaying her husband's love, but she's also demonstrating his wealth. So provision is doing two things. It's showing a wife and others that she is loved, but it's also in some ways bolstering his masculinity and exemplifying the fact that he can afford to provide for his wife in such an extravagant way. Right, and finally, in thinking about this, she also suggests, love needs to be nourished and should be constantly cultivated through consumption. Right, so there's the idea that consumption to show love is not just a one-time deal, as with the engagement ring, but it should be continually displayed, justifying continual consumption. So it's this entwinement of love with provision and consumption that's a key theme that I'm pursuing here. Engagement ring is a small example, but it points to a larger point, that women in the U.S. and elsewhere are part of a gendered economic structure. And a key underpinning of this is women's historical dependence on providing men. So the graphs you see here on the screen are showing you labor force participation of women in the U.S. across the 20th century. And so as you'll see, even while there was a steady increase in women working outside the home, it wasn't until 1980 that more than 50% of married women worked outside the home. By 2000, it was about 60%, and for single women, the figure was about 70%. So the critical point is that for most of the 20th century, U.S. women have been dependent on providing men. So even now, though increasing numbers of women are working, many are in part-time jobs, sex-segregated sectors with wage and promotion ceilings, and are not earning the same as men. So it's striking to see this in a setting where we'd expect women to have the most power and to be the most independent. This is part of a gendered economic structure that's not unique to the U.S., but is evident historically and currently in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And so some of the legislation creating these gendered structures were linked to colonialism. So women kept in rural reserves to farm, while their partners, husbands, and fathers were allowed or forced, in fact, to migrate to cities, mines, and other places to work for pay. So many of these patterns have remained, leaving many women dependent on remittances, being subsistence farmers, and many living in poverty with few options for independent living outside of male provision of land and resources. So I think the historical elephant in the room in many conversations about transactional sex is marriage. And there's a sense in which marriage, or the promise of it, legitimates exchange. So it's one thing for a husband-to-be to spend $5,000 on his wife-to-be, but quite another if a man spent the same amount of money on a sexual partner who he was not intending to marry. And so Carayel says, marriage is the pole around which sexual culture is organized. So part of this implies that understanding what's happening to marriage and the dynamics of marriage helps us understand other kinds of sexual relationships in a given culture, such as transactional sex. And so if, as Ashforth, talking about young South African men, says the path to marriage is paved with money, then there's a sense in which marriage is really the ultimate transactional relationship. It's an inherently economic and material transaction. And historically and in many places currently, bride wealth and dowry systems have persisted. But it's worth thinking in contemporary times about transactional sex as a modern alternative or an adaptation when marriage is delayed or unavailable, or as people are starting to marry later and are having relationships in the meantime. So I'm now going to focus on 3 theories that help us think about these dynamics a bit more. So the first is the patriarchal bargain by Denise Candiotti. The idea that here is that there's a sort of deal between men and women, or more broadly, patriarchy and women in a given society. And the deal is that men are going to provide financially, and so that's either land for farming, a house, as well as cash or monetary assistance, and women are going to provide reproductive, domestic, and conjugal provision. And so I found an excerpt from some work by Anne Swidler and Susan Watkins, and I'll read it because I think it highlights this bargain quite well. And so this excerpt is from a journal written by local Malawians recording everyday conversations about AIDS. So I'm going to read the quote. Now, what is happening is that my husband wants to marry another wife who is his cousin. I've tried to ask him to tell me why he wants to do this, but his reply to me was that she is his cousin, and he cannot allow her to be getting worried when men are not coming to ask for marriage to her. He told me that he always gets concerned when he sees or hears women who worry that they're not getting married or that they need help, but they don't have means of getting the help, like money to buy soap, relish, clothes, and other needs of their daily life, while he knows that he can take care of them, for he has money and a shop where they can be getting their needs. But God says, help the needy. So when I ask him, is this the way you can help the needy through the exchange with sex? He says, do you think I can just keep spending property with nothing in return? Right, so this is one example of what this bargain would look like. I'm providing them money for their needs. They're providing conjugal privileges, right? And the appropriate context for this exchange is marriage, which is how the quote or the excerpt begins, right? So this is often an implicit understanding in marriage that's made quite explicit here. The idea that male provision or breadwinning and women provision of domestic care and conjugal provision. And so the bargain then, this patriarchal bargain, is broken when there are sufficient numbers of eligible men, depending on how that's defined, are not available for marriage, or when men don't, can't, or won't provide. And so transactional sex then can be seen as a solution in this context, where smaller, shorter-term exchanges with women are possible, as opposed to longer-term financial commitments that marriage entails. I think we often talk about young women in transactional sex literature, but it's worth reflecting on what's happening to young men. So the traditional paths to manhood and adulthood in many settings, and here I'm thinking primarily about patriarchal settings or as opposed to matriarchal settings. The traditional paths to manhood and adulthood involved provision of land, bride wealth, and inheriting these things from male elders. And so the contemporary path to adulthood, however, meant that increasing numbers of men could earn their own money and finance their own weddings because of education or jobs. So rather than depending on male elders for access to these things, they could get them themselves. However, there have been disruptions to these pathways, and increasing numbers of young African men are out of work or lack of stable jobs after education. And to the extent that relationships are predicated on money, increasing numbers of young men can't sustain long-term relationships. So the phrase "no romance without finance," for example, coined by Mills and Sewa Kirianga, talking about young Ugandan men. And in my own work, one young man I interviewed said, I had a girlfriend. She was very expensive in that she'll always need sanitary towels, oils that will make her comfortable, and some clothes that I could not afford. So having a girlfriend was just a problem and very expensive. The relationship couldn't have continued if I couldn't provide. So at the same time that contemporary pathways are crumbling or taking longer to achieve, it's become increasingly difficult to return to traditional paths. So population growth has meant that there isn't enough land to split among sons, which they can then use to host a wife who can engage in subsistence farming. There's no money for bridals because all the cows have been sold, so they can't establish an independent household. So some researchers have started to talk about a crisis of social reproduction because many young men are unable to provide. They can't be a breadwinner. They can't establish an independent household. They can't afford to marry or pay bride wealth, and they can't afford to sustain long-term relationships. So within this setup then, transactional sex again becomes a solution. Small amounts of money, no expectation of fidelity, while waiting for marriage or time when they can afford it, for both young men and women. So a second theory then is thinking about the purchase of intimacy, with the idea that money and love are always entwined. And this is from work by Viviana Zeliza. And so she describes the sort of cultural norm of hostile worlds. And this is the idea that such a profound contradiction exists between intimate social relations and monetary transfers that any contact between the two spheres inevitably leads to moral contamination and degradation. So there's a sense in which there's an extreme separation of sexual intimacy and money. And once they meet, they're not pure anymore, and a relationship is somehow corrupted. But she argues that this is a comfortable myth, that in practice people have what she calls differentiated ties, and that in fact all intimate relationships involve monetary transfers and include a wide variety of relationships marked by distinct forms of payment. So there are different symbols, rituals, practices, and physically distinguishable forms of money to mark these different social relationships. So for example, a gift card when dating, a diamond ring when engaged, and cash transfers when married. But they all involve monetary exchange. It's just the form in which the exchange happens that varies by social relationships. So when we see young African women receiving things like soap, perfume, cash, and so on, sometimes the literature puts different weight on soap and perfume than it does with cash, when in fact in some ways they're the same thing. Exchange in the context of a sexual relationship that's in many ways universal. And indeed, it's the absence of exchange that should seem puzzling in an intimate relationship, not its presence. Now, we care, of course, because exchange introduces other kinds of dynamics. So as Mouse argues, gifts are not free. They create obligations to reciprocate. So because access to money is not just gendered, but generational, right? So men and older men in particular, young women are in relationship with someone who's doubly empowered by their gender and their age. So it becomes difficult to bargain for things like safe sex, HIV testing, and so on in such a context. So the final theory I want to talk about is the global production of consuming women, which I develop and use in my work. But part of the precedent is from the authors whose work I've accepted here. So I try and pursue the question of consumption, or what is driving transactional sex. Why do young women desire consumption to such a degree that they're willing to engage in relationships that many know are risky? After all, many of the qualitative accounts of transactional sex among young women are not just about destitute girls. They're school or college-going girls in contexts where school is not free. And so either parents or family are able to afford to pay for their school fees. And they're living in households where basic needs such as food and shelter are met. And in fact, in the DHS surveys, it's women who live in the wealthiest households who have the highest rates of HIV. And so to the extent that transactional sex underlies those findings, we're not really just talking about girls who are the poorest, but we're talking about girls who have some access to income. And so perhaps, a way of thinking about this is suggested by Suzanne Leclerc-Medladler, who argues that they're transacting for modernity. And so trying to understand this urge to consume, I try and put it in global perspective by showing that the relationship between provision and relationships is not unique to young African women. So, for example, Angela McRobbie documents and talks about how women in the U.S. were produced as ideal subjects of consumption in 20th century America. So they were central to marketing and retail economies in the post-war World War II years in particular, with household products as a key site. And the similar dynamics at the same time were happening in Zimbabwe. And so Timothy Burke's work, for example, talks about how marketers believe fervently that women were the key to changing the material composition of the African home, that women controlled most purchases and most tastes. So he shows how marketers, and this is companies like Unilever, which are operating in Zimbabwe as well as the U.S. at the same time. So he shows how women were targeted and cultivated to basically perceive things as needs that they had to purchase. And he focuses on hygiene products like soap in particular. Anita Harris has talked about the reinvention of youth citizenship as consumer power being largely enacted through young women. And so she argues that girls have become the emblem of this consumer citizen. So the idea of girl power, for example, is increasingly bound up with consumption, that girls show they are powerful by consuming and by displaying the products that they have bought. And then finally, Francis Nyamjo puts it in a sort of more extreme way. He says, as everywhere, the global televangelism of consumption is converting Africans into various degrees of consumerism and seeking to mold youth and consumer zombies. And his article is about young women's transactional relationships in West and Eastern Africa. And so the larger point here is that the urge to consume among women and young women in particular is being documented everywhere. But the means to attain independent consumption is what varies widely. And so what is striking is that young African women are drawing on traditional assumptions, the expectation that men will provide, the idea that love is demonstrated through provision, and the patriarchal bargain that sex is not for free, to achieve modern consuming womanhood. So in conclusion then, we have both sort of a micro-level understanding that the desire for money and gifts is in fact entangled with relationships, and that the two are in a sense intertwined. And at a macro level, the engine of transactional relationships is both historical and persistent. So the expectation that men are going to provide has persisted, as has the dependence of women on men, economically in particular. But coupled with that is also a breakdown of the patriarchal bargain, as same-aged men who are safe from an HIV point of view have economic struggles and are taking longer to marry, and also the cultivation and production of consuming women. And so this leaves older, wealthier men as the ideal partners for young women pursuing needs, relationships, and modernity. So I'll stop here for now, and I'm happy to take your questions.
If you could speak to how these rich theoretical perspectives have informed what you think are the implications in your context in the work that you've done in Kenya in particular for intervention, to the extent that you could link those together.
Yeah, I think that was part of the hardest thing to do in some of my work is not just sort of understanding what's going on, but trying to figure out how to change things. One sort of thing I was thinking about was the economic implications, and so I thought harder about the nature of consumption, especially thinking about the idea that many of the girls who are involved in transactional sex are not in those relationships for things like food and shelter, but then those relationships for things like perfume and soap and so on. And so part of, the kinds of things that girls need are things that get finished every month. So sanitary towels, which they need every month, or perfume, which gets finished, or oil for their skin, which gets finished. And so I realized that consumption is continual. And so it's not just a sort of a one-time gift of cash that's needed, but access to continual income. And part of what I found in my work is that girls had a harder time finding jobs and were not paid as much, and also were expected to do more work at home, which meant they were less able to find their own jobs. And so I started looking at some of the current intervention literature that exists. So, for example, some of the cash transfer programs, the conditional cash transfer programs. And, for all the controversy around the programs, one thing that was striking was giving girls small amounts of pocket money, especially while they're in school, seemed to almost completely substitute for older partners. For example, in a study in Malawi. And so that could be one option. Another option I thought about was trying to unpack exactly what girls consider needs. And the one thing that came up quite a bit was things like sanitary towels. And I was wondering, why in particular that was so important, because a lot of the local women in that setting were using other kinds of local solutions for many years prior to access to sanitary towels. But one of the things I noticed was it was connected with the idea of modernity, that modern girls have sanitary towels. And so in the policy chapter of my book, I try and suggest things like menstrual cups, which are reusable, and, which is a sort of a one-time purchase, so that at least you take away the one thing that girls say that they need on a regular basis, and they don't feel that they have to engage in relationships in order to meet those needs. And finally, I talk about these two competing normative systems that were occurring, especially in school settings. And one normative system said that, girls should focus on school now and wait to consume later. And those are the girls who are less likely to be involved in transactional relationships. Whereas the other normative system was saying consume now, and as opposed to waiting later. And part of this was sort of entwined with disillusionment with education, and whether education would give them jobs to make their own money. And so the girls who sort of decided to wait were the ones who were less likely to engage in transactional relationships. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but I was trying to sort of think in the policy chapter for how, thinking harder about the nature of consumption and particular vulnerability of girls, especially before they get married.
Wonderful presentation, really a lot to think about. Thank you. I'm working on sex workers' rights and HIV here in the U.S., and I was really struck especially by your comments about the contamination and degradation that's perceived to occur when we talk about money and sex and the transaction that's occurring there. There's very profound examples of that in the U.S., and I think that globally when we talk about sex workers' rights, what we're finding in terms of the resistance is the really anger that comes up for people when one tries to explore explicitly the connection there. I wondered if you have experienced that and how, what your experience is in talking about it, whether you feel as though that you're also hearing this very strong backlash to any kind of overt acknowledgement of the connection between money and sex and how that relates to sex work.
And actually, Sanyu, just to add, two other individuals have explicitly asked, based on this rich theoretical perspective, how then do you differentiate transactional sex from sex work? So if you wanted to try to tackle all of that at once.
So let me start with the latter first. I tend to think about it as a continuum in one sense. that if money is present in all kinds of relationships or all intimate relationships, that the question then is where the line is drawn in a given culture. And so what seems similar in many settings is the timing of when the exchange happens. And so if the exchange happens immediately after sex or immediately before sex, then it's more likely to be seen as sex work than if the timing varies encounter to encounter. But also, I think in my work I'm careful to sort of try and observe how people in that setting themselves define sex work, because it's been clear to me that local folks in the different settings I've worked in have a very clear sense of what is sex work and what is not sex work. And so if a man doesn't give a girl money and they're involved in a sexual relationship, in girls would essentially be looked down on, that almost like they don't value themselves, that they're sort of just giving themselves away and they have low self-esteem. And so the meaning of transactional, or the meaning of money in a given setting, and there would be, if there's no money, there's a problem. But I think part of what I'm arguing is that in settings in the West, for example, the U.S., that because there's this sort of strong cultural norm that money and sex are not supposed to mix, no one wants to say that this is in fact what's happening. And so there's this sort of comfortable myth that, relationships don't involve money. But when you look at actual practices, you see that actually there's a presence of money and a lot of money, in fact. So in the case of the engagement ring, for example, there's a lot of money. Or if you think about, how much, is spent on dating, things like dinner out and movies, and sort of this continual expectation that men are supposed to pay most of the dating costs, you realize that money is present even in relationships where people would say that money and love are not mixed. And so I think there's sort of a contradiction in terms, or sort of a gap between what people will say about relationships, even in Western context, and what they actually do. In relation to the first question about the controversy, I try and really challenge people on that by presenting some of the examples I just gave. And when we start with the example of an engagement ring and then sort of move to other kinds of exchanges that happen in relationships, I find that you bring people along as opposed to starting from saying that sex work is just like any other relationship, because people on the face of it are uncomfortable, with the idea that no, I'm not being paid for sex. I'm an independent woman, but then when you look at it, you realize, well, women have always been dependent on providing men. The question is how do you make that legitimate? Right, and so marriage is the ultimate legitimator of exchange, and it's a relationship in which the largest amounts of exchanges from men to women occur. But sex work has always existed, and in many settings in the developing world, women make more money from sex work than they would make from other kinds of jobs, and so it's an interesting sort of cultural artifact that I try and unpack, especially in the book, because of this contradiction that I've noted between what people say and what they actually do.
Have young men as well as young women not been the targets of modern consumerism generally? Can you give some examples why it has been young women in particular that have been targeted? You seem to be implying that this is almost a 21st century Fordian consumerism. Also, could you comment on women's role in the informal labor market, as this makes up a lot of the disparity between male and female participation in the formal labor force? I'm thinking, for example, about Bostrop's work in the 1970s and Elizabeth Schmidt's work in Zimbabwe.
So first, yes, both men and women are targeted for consumption. But what I noticed historically is women were targeted more and, in fact, considered central to purchasing. And so, for example, in the in the U.S. literature. The account sort of suggested that women are the ones who are controlling purchases, so we're going to target them for labor-saving devices. So if we think, for example, 1950s U.S., you have the baby boom and a lot of women who are not working outside the home. So as I showed in that graph, it wasn't until 1980 that more than 50% of women worked outside the home. So there's an assumption that women are dependent on providing men, and in fact that they're supposed to have skills in convincing providing men to spend on things like washing machines and dishwashers, etc., as part of labor-saving devices within the household. And so it was striking to me when I looked at what was happening in different settings in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's some historical work by Lynn Thomas in South Africa where she shows how sort of a bundle of commodities that were targeted at women in particular that were tied to modernity, so makeup, cosmetics, etc., marketed to young South African women. And as I showed in the case of Zimbabwe, marketers targeting women for household products. And so even though both men and women are targeted for consumption, it was striking to me how much it was women who were produced and cultivated as consumers. And I think the other thing I noticed, and I do mixed methods work, and so I like to not only look at the qualitative data, but also the quantitative data. And so when I interviewed young people, they said, girls can't find jobs or find it hard to find jobs, but boys find it easy to find, especially part-time jobs or jobs in general. And then I looked at some of the DHS data and found this reflected. That there were much higher labor force participation rates, or the percentage of boys working for pay relative to girls working for pay at all ages. And it wasn't until I think the late 20s that you started to see the working rates for women, move up substantially. And so if you couple that with then sort of the idea that girls' needs tend to be these continual needs, right? So I need sanitary pads every month, I need oil every month, I need, Vaseline every month, versus the kinds of things that boys were saying they needed, like, I don't need much. So there's this sense of sort of a gendered construction of needs, where girls need more than boys, but then girls don't have as much access to money the way boys do. And so part of the problem of the gendered economic structure is you have the people who need the most money having the least access to it. And so this sort of exacerbates the dependence on providing men. And so there's a sense in which, consumption of consumer needs, especially continual consumer needs, makes it even more complicated. Informal work was definitely a solution. And so some of the young women out of school I interviewed were engaging in what they called, small jobs, right? So selling vegetables on the side of the road, selling mobile phones, scratch cards, selling second-hand clothing, and so on. But again, the work was not as stable as, say, the jobs for men in construction or jobs for men in the transportation industry. And so even though women did have access to some work and informal work in particular, if you contrast it with young men and men's access to work more broadly, men had more access to stable and better paying work than women did. And so you still have this sort of gendered economic structure that privileges men. So men are more likely to have access to money to consume as they want relative to women.
I did some work in Tanzania with women who were participants in a microbicide trial, and these were women that worked in bars and restaurants, and many of them were involved had discussed being involved in some form of transactional sex with customers, but also in other kinds of relationships with men, in describing relationships with men that were either marriage or long-term or short-term or casual. So sort of very different ways of describing relationships with men, and then discussed how money or gifts or dependency were related to these different types of relationships. And one of the things that that sort of arose from the conversations were that many of the women were feeling quite let down by long-term relationships or marriages where they couldn't rely on men to support them financially. So in fact were seeking more short-term casual relationships and some sort of financial transaction so that they could be much more independent, so that they could pay for their children's education and make decisions about the house, around the household needs. That didn't mean that they depended on men. And I just wondered if any of that has arisen in your work, the idea that women may be receiving some sort of transactional financial exchange for them to be more independent for relationships with men.
Oh, that's really interesting. And in fact, your work reminds me of Jessica Gregg's work, and she works in Brazil. And it's an example of this breakdown of the patriarchal bargain I was talking about. So when men can provide, especially in the context of marriage, then the bargain is broken, and so women's incentives then to participate in marriage changes, and transactional sex then becomes a much better solution, precisely because they're released from the obligations of this patriarchal bargain, but have access to money to be independent and engage in their own decision making. And so Jessica Gregg in Brazil finds the same thing, that when men can provide, then women engage in shorter term relationships and essentially revolt or rebel and refuse to get married if men can't provide. And so it's striking to me just how important male provision is, regardless of the context, as long as you have lack of good economic options for women. And so this sort of reminds me of the earlier question. I think that the biggest intervention is really to enable women to have good economic options, and not just I think a lot of the development sort of initiatives are aimed at essentially subsidizing small informal labor market jobs. But I hope that that's not going to be at the expense of stable jobs that are sort of part of a larger, more stable economy, so that women and young women in particular are not sort of having to sort of have jobs that rise and fall depending on that are much more vulnerable in terms of access to steady income to take care of their needs. Because this is one thing that I've seen is common in a lot of settings, that the kinds of wage jobs tend to be women don't have as much access to those sorts of jobs, and so the jobs they do have access to may not be as reliable in terms of getting access to income. But it's just this, I think, dependence on providing men that makes transactional sex, I think, a solution for many women.
Much of the discussion so far is focused on the economic and consumption aspects of transactional sex, but what about the emotional and social aspects? Can you talk about how sexual relationships and sexual debut are seen as a social status, particularly for young women in university settings?
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned earlier, I called my book Love, Money, and HIV because I think that love is a really important part of the story. And in fact, I think it's love that entangles young women in transactional relationships for longer. It's much easier to leave a relationship if it's just about money than it is if emotions and love are concerned. And so in fact, in some of my work with orphan girls, I found that one of the attractions for them, for all their partners, wasn't just that they provided, but they show the male provision as a sign of concern. So if they felt that the guardians were not concerned about them or caring for them well, they felt, well, at least I'm being cared for, or this man is concerned about me. And then also they felt that the older partners were much more likely to provide emotional support in the absence of parental love because they'd lost their parents. And so I think love is a really important part of the story here and really complicates things. The idea that love is evidenced by provision. So in terms of the importance, the sexual debut, at least in the setting I studied, was quite young. So many girls, at the average age at first sex was about 15. And for many girls, at least first sex wasn't always voluntary, or wasn't always what they had planned or what they had hoped. But sexual relationships, I definitely agree, was sign of status, especially if it was a sexual relationship with a generous boyfriend. And so it's definitely a marker to be in a relationship of that kind in some settings. And so I definitely saw that in some of my work. In fact, the girls who, and again, it's really hard to sort of untangle love and money in this case, or love and provision in this case, because one way in which people would admire a young woman in a sexual relationship was if she was in a relationship with a man who was taking care of her well, right? So she was able to look good and dress well because of being in a relationship with a generous boyfriend. And so it was not so much the relationship as the evidence of that man's regard or love for her through provision of consumer products that gave her social status. So it's hard to, at least in my work, I've found it hard to disentangle the emotional aspects from how the emotions, at least a man's emotions toward a woman, were evidenced, i.e. through provision.
If you could talk about the significance for HIV prevention of being able to distinguish between sex work and transactional sex.
The irony is, of course, that the reason why we care about transactional sex is because of bargaining power and how likely girls are to negotiate things like safe sex and HIV testing in the context of a relationship where a man is providing. And so the irony, if we sort of think about the sex work, transactional sex as a continuum, or the presence of money as a continuum, there's a sense in which sex workers have, in some ways, the most leverage, precisely because it's sort of seen as just about the money, as opposed to transactional sex, where you start to have things like emotion involved, right? So if he loves me or if I trust him, then I'm not going to use a condom, right? So these sorts of emotions then get entangled in decisions around safe sex. So, as I think Michael Flood says, trust is a prophylactic strategy, right? Because he's providing, he's showing me he loves me, and so I don't want to use a condom, whereas sex work, there's no such illusion, because it's not about emotions necessarily, but more about sort of a form of work for women. And so I think one sort of way in is many observers or writers of transactional sex have said that girls seem to have a lot of agency in the entry and exiting of relationships. And so one of the things I suggest in the policy chapter of my book is the time for girls to negotiate HIV testing is right at the beginning, or the entry into a transactional relationship. And so if at the time they have the most bargaining power, they can insist on HIV testing. And then even if condom use declines in the context of a relationship, at least she'll know the HIV status of her partner at the beginning of the relationship. And so I think now, of course, we know that sex work is also complicated. And so the sex workers I've interviewed say that men are willing to pay more money for sex without a condom. But again, I think that there's much more leverage for a sex worker, especially in a setting where there's a lot of demand for sex workers. And so I think as far as HIV prevention is concerned, I sort of see the two as distinct, because I think that it's emotion that complicates transactional sex. And because of emotion, safe sex becomes difficult to negotiate or problematic in transactional sex in ways that is not the case with sex work. leveraging the power that girls have at the beginning of a relationship to insist on HIV testing in particular, I think is important. Condom use, I think, is more problematic, not only because it requires continual negotiation throughout a relationship, but also because, as I've found and others have noted in their work, long-term relationships tend to not involve condoms. So one of my respondents said you can use a condom one time, you can use it twice, but the third time, she's going to ask, a young man said she's going to ask, do you think I'm a prostitute? Or do you think, I have AIDS? And so there's a sense in which continued use of condoms implies continued lack of trust. Mm-hmm. And so it seems HIV testing is really the main sort of intervention strategy, at least as far as transactional sex is concerned. So my email address is on the first page of the slides. So please feel free to email me if you have questions. I'd be happy to continue to discuss. This is the first time I've sort of talked about my work sort of after finishing the book, and so it's been great to have all these questions and to have a chance to continue these conversations. So please feel free to contact me afterwards, and I'll be happy to reply.